Mr. Carter is 84 years old male, and he lives at home. He is categorized as community full dual, which means he lives in the community, is enrolled in Medicare, and receives full Medicaid benefits. By using this beneficiary, this scenario demonstrates how to calculate a payment risk score in payment year 2025 for a Part C beneficiary who is not in end-stage renal disease status, or part of a program of all-inclusive care for the elderly plan. Let's use the risk score formula to calculate Mr. Carter's final payment risk score using the 2020 CMS-HCC model, version 24. To calculate the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic relative factors, we must first identify the correct factor for each relevant demographic variable. Since we know that Mr. Carter is a male aged 80 to 84, we need to capture the factor displayed in the cell that intersects row 80 to 84 years and the community, full benefit dual, aged column, which is 0.803. The only other value we need to consider when computing the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic relative factors is his Medicaid interaction factor. Since Mr. Carter resides in the community, this factor does not apply. Therefore, the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic relative factors, using the 2024 CMS-HCC model, is 0.803. Mr. Carter's information shown on your screen. Notice that the payment HCCs identified for this beneficiary are HCC 19, diabetes without complications, and HCC 111, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. To calculate Mr. Carter's raw risk score, simply add the sum of his demographic factors to the sum of his disease factors. Use the Blended Risk Score, PDF, button to generate Mr. Carter's risk score worksheet. Mr. Carter's raw risk score is calculated by adding the sum of his demographic factors, which is 0.803, to the sum of disease factors, which is 0.537. Mr. Carter's raw risk score is 1.340 using the 2020 CMS-HCC model. And then must divide the raw risk score, 1.340, by the 2025 normalization factor for the 2020 CMS-HCC model, which is 1.153, to get a normalized score of 1.16218. You must round this number to the third decimal place to get Mr. Carter's rounded normalized risk score, which is 1.162. The next step in the process is to multiply Mr. Carter's rounded normalized risk score by 1 minus the MA coding pattern adjustment factor. Since we are using the Part C CMS-HCC model to calculate Mr. Carter's risk score, we also need to apply the MA coding pattern adjustment factor. To do this, simply multiply the rounded normalized risk score, which is 1.162, by 1 minus the MA coding pattern adjustment factor, which is 0.941, to get the MA coding pattern adjusted risk score of 1.09344. You must round this number to the third decimal point to get a rounded MA coding pattern adjusted risk score, which is 1.093. To calculate the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic relative factors, we must first identify the correct factor for each relevant demographic variable. Since we know that Mr. Carter is a male aged 80 to 84, we need to capture the factor displayed in the cell that intersects row 80 to 84 years and the community, full benefit dual, aged column, which is 0.789. The only other value we need to consider when computing the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic relative factors is his Medicaid interaction factor. Since Mr. Carter resides in the community, this factor does not apply. Therefore, the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic relative factors, using the 2024 CMS-HCC model, is 0.789. Mr. Carter's information. Notice that the HCCs identified for payment year 2025 and for use with the 2024 CMS-HCC model, version 28, for this beneficiary are, HCC 38, diabetes with glycemic, unspecified, or no complications, and HCC 280, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, interstitial lung disorders, and other chronic lung disorders. Mr. Carter has the diagnosis code HCC 19, diabetes without complications in the 2020 CMS-HCC model, which the table shows was updated to HCC 38, diabetes with glycemic, unspecified, or no complications in the 2024 CMS-HCC model. Since there are no disease or disabled/disease interactions for this beneficiary, to compute the sum of Mr. Carter's disease relative factors, add the relative factor for HCC 38, which is 0.186, to the relative factor for HCC 280, which is 0.390. This makes the sum of Mr. Carter's disease relative factors, using the 2024 CMS-HCC model, 0.576. The first step is to add the sum of Mr. Carter's demographic factors, which is 0.789, to the sum of his disease factors, which is 0.576, to determine the raw risk score. Mr. Carter's raw risk score, using the 2024 CMS-HCC model, is 1.365. We must divide the raw risk score, 1.365, by the 2024 normalization factor for the 2024 CMS-HCC model, which is 1.045, to get a normalized score of 1.30622. Next, we must round this number to the third decimal place to get a rounded normalized score of 1.306. Please note that if we skip this rounding step, it may affect the risk score at the third decimal place, which will impact the final calculated payment risk score. Since we are using the Part C CMS-HCC model to calculate Mr. Carter's risk score, we also need to apply the MA coding pattern adjustment factor. To do this, multiply the rounded normalized risk score, which is 1.306, by 1 minus the MA coding pattern adjustment factor, 0.059, which is 0.941, to get the MA coding pattern adjusted risk score of 1.22894. We must round this number to the third decimal place to get a rounded MA coding pattern adjusted risk score of 1.229. This is Mr. Carter's risk score using the 2024 CMS-HCC model. For calendar year 2025, the Part C risk scores will be calculated as the sum of 67% of risk scores using the 2024 CMS-HCC model and 33% of risk scores using the 2020 CMS-HCC model. In Module 6 Computer-Based Training, you will learn the changes that impact calculating risk scores for calendar year 2025 and briefly reviewed what has not changed. Also, please refer to the sample PDF output of blended risk scores generated from Medicare Informatics Risk Score Calculator. We believe that voice of the customer is a critical component to deliver value and happiness to clients. Please feel free to provide your feedback to info@medicareinformatics.com. Thank you.